welcome back for another Naval History episode of the Proceedings Podcast. This episode is sponsored by Booz Allen. Booz Allen delivers outcomes with speed for the nation's most critical defense priorities. Work with solution engineers who use AI, cyber, and quantum to help war fighters collaborate faster with allies and partners, from the open seas to the edge of space. Learn more at boozallen.com/defense. Well, lovers of all things naval and historical, we're pleased to have joining us today an young up-and-coming talent. He's already appeared in the pages of Proceedings, and he now makes his debut in the current June 2025 issue of Naval History with a very prescient and actually kind of timely article that looks at the tanker war that roiled the Persian Gulf in the 1980s. In the midst of the Iran-Iraq conflict, tankers shipping the vital fluid from the Gulf were now getting caught in the crossfire of events, and the U.S. Navy stepped in. It was a resounding success in the end, but there were a whole lot of lessons to be learned about being more prepared for mine warfare. Mine warfare, that great bugaboo that often gets overlooked, but if you look at the stats, it's one of the most damaging things for the Navy since the Second World War. Here to explain all that to us and talk about this wonderful article, which is the third prize winner in the CNO Naval History Essay Contest Midshipman Cadets category, is Second Lieutenant Quentin Zimmer. Quentin, welcome aboard.
Thank you for having me on today, sir.
It's our great pleasure. So, this has been a troubled spot of the world for several decades now, as this article points out, and current headlines continue to verify. But the tanker war is kind of an overlooked chapter of the U.S. Navy in the 80s. It's often sort of glossed over by what comes after and all that sort of thing. But this was a big deal, and the operations that were undertaken were pretty large scale. But there were key lessons to be learned from that, were there not? I'll let you expound on that if you would.
Yes, sir, of course. I appreciate you having me on today again. I'd like to say thank you first and foremost. And also just a quick disclaimer. Any views that I express here today are my own and not representative of any official stance of the Department of Defense or Marine Corps. So to jump into the article, I'd really like to summarize the macro context of the paper that I wrote and sort of setting the scene for the events that occurred during the 1980s and the U.S. military's involvement in the tanker war between Iran and Iraq. So this is amid the great power competition of the Cold War, where a regional conflict between Iran and Iraq over land resources and regime legitimacy spread to the maritime domain and had international ramifications. So I'll allow listeners to read between the lines a little bit, but I think that has a lot of staying power in terms of lessons to this day, where we can use this historical case as a moment to understand what lessons from the past may be able to affect the decisions that we made today, both for U.S. military operations and just a better understanding of history.
That's a good setup for this. Now, let's give a little historical backdrop. The mullahs take over Iran in 1979. The Iran-Iraq War erupts 1980, and it's in full force by the early 80s. Suddenly it becomes a maritime issue as well. Let's talk about how that evolved.
Yes, sir, of course. That's very important historical context that you point out. Yes, the Iranian Revolution, and Saddam Hussein, the president of Iraq at the time, is having concerns over his ability to control his regime domestically and also the viability of Iraq to maintain its regional power in the Middle East. And so the war begins in 1980. And over the course of several years, a very important point that I would like to make is that this conflict that starts primarily in the land domain reaches an attritional stalemate along the border, roughly where the country's borders are today. And so by 1984, both states are seeking to break this stalemate through some sort of breakthrough. And so what this looks like in 1984, that's an important date for both the official start or more recognized start of the tanker war, and also when we begin to see this form of maneuver from the land domain to the maritime domain. And so seeking to break that stalemate, both states turn to the sea And that's where we begin to see more regular and also more damaging attacks on things like oil platforms in the Persian Gulf, and also attacks on merchant shipping of third-party nations.
Mm-hmm. And it's just that thing where the third-party nations are getting attacked and caught in all this that leads to the U.S. Navy's involvement. Tell us about reflagging and how we ended up backing Kuwait's play in all this, because we were not the only one whose dance card they were seeking to be on.
Of course, sir. So there are many actors involved, as with any historical case, but Kuwait really is a central actor in our story here today. This is, again, like I mentioned before, in the backdrop of the Cold War. And so as the U.S. and the Soviet Union are competing globally for international influence, these smaller regional actors, such as Kuwait, are seeking security guarantees from larger countries to be able to protect their ability to conduct normal commerce operations. And so over the course of several years, as the Iran-Iraq war continued and the tanker war begins, shipping is threatened, states like Kuwait turned to larger players on the international stage and sought security guarantees to be able to continue their normal commerce and oil shipping operations. And so Kuwait reached out to both the Soviet Union and the United States to attempt to obtain what we call reflagging, which is referenced when one ship sails under the protection and legal codification of another nation. And so that provides a legal means of providing security and military force to protect those vessels. And so not wanting to cede that influence to the Soviet Union, and also wanting to promote free trade, freedom of navigation, and secure global commons, the United States agrees to reflag several Kuwaiti oil tankers in the later 1980s during this conflict.
And once they're flying the stars and stripes, that puts them under the protection of the U.S. Navy. And let's talk about how they take this on and face this challenge.
Yes, sir. So a key date in these reflagging operations is 1987. And so these are when convoy operations begin. So if we think 1980, the conflict between Iran and Iraq begins. 1984, it primarily opens up into the maritime domain. And then even more, several years later, by 1987, this is when reflagging begins to occur in bulk, and also when convoy operations begin. So this definitely was not a short or quick conflict, and these things take time historically to develop to what we're talking about today. But 1987 is a key date for when those convoy operations begin. And the first convoy does not necessarily go according to plan. Like most military operations, when they first encounter friction, or when the enemy is able to get a vote, the first convoy operation was with the Bridgeton and a number of U.S. naval vessels. And there is incidentally a mine strike of that vessel. And so that sort of sets the stage, sir, into what I think we may talk about a little bit later in this podcast, is the U.S. Navy's ability at the time to be able to perform in the mine warfare domain. And from there, striking a mine on the first convoy really sets the tone for how these operations continue until the U.S. is able to regain the initiative and start going on the offense to prevent sort of acts like these from going on.
Mm-hmm. It was an inauspicious beginning for Operation Earnest Will, right? And it came out, didn't it, that naval officers at that point had to sort of admit that they hadn't swept for mines prior to embarking on the route. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, that is. There's several instances outlined more thoroughly in my article, but most pressing was the lack of mine sweeping vessels that were in the region, in the area of operations at the time, and sort of a more institutional, cultural non-appreciation for these sorts of warfare, where some types of other missions may get more funding or mental priority in terms of training or manning or being ready to react to these sorts of circumstances. That really wasn't the case when we're looking at how we conducted mine warfare at the time.
Yeah, but they're going to learn this sort of the hard way as they go forward. And Well, let's talk about how Operation Earnest Will played out, highs and lows and whatnot, and then how it segues into the next phase of all this. But let's go through Earnest Will a little more first.
Of course. So that first convoy began around July of 1987, named Ernest Will. An important note there, just in the history of the U.S. Navy, is that this would comprise one of the largest surface warfare operations since World War II. So we're in the late Cold War era. There hasn't been a ton of naval activity compared to what was happening during World War II. And so that escort of the oil tanker Bridgeton started with the USS Kidd, the USS Fox, and the USS Cromwell. And so going through that convoy, they strike a mine, and the Bridgeton's captain reports it felt like a 500-ton hammer had hit the ship. And so when we're talking about both the inability for vessels at sea to be able to avoid these types of obstacles at times, and also the sheer power that these weapons represent, I think that really demonstrates a strong picture. And those sorts of comments, from what I was able to see in my research, are very typical of ships striking mines, that it felt just a very extremely heavy, strong percussive force, and really just shocks the minds of the sailors that are on board. And so another common photo from this convoy is of the Bridgeton leading the front, even though it has already struck a mine, and the Navy ships in escort were behind it, so as to allow the oil tanker, which was supposed to be protecting the convoy, to clear the minefield and save the Navy warships. And so we were talking about how this was setting the scene for the later conflict, and just showing that these initial moments of being caught off guard continue until the U.S. is able to regain the initiative with several other operations later.
Mm-hmm. I think what a lot of people, if they do remember the tanker war at all, what they're remembering is what happens to the USS Samuel B. Roberts. That's kind of a well-known incident from all of this. We should talk about that, the fate of the FFG.
Yes, sir, of course. That's really the crux of my article, and also what got me interested in writing about the topic. Just sort of as a sidebar, I really enjoy finding stories that are not always on the mind of the public, and sometimes don't get as much attention as other moments or events in history. And so that is really what we have here, an incredibly vivid and powerful story that is able to give us lessons today, that I enjoyed being able to delve into the great scholarship that came before me to sort of reinvigorate it and dust it off and bring it back to the mind of the public. And so that is very much the case with the Samuel B. Roberts. In February 1988, so this is almost more than a year after, or just before a year of convoy operations beginning, they reported to the Gulf to support convoy operations. It's a FFG 58, that's the hull number. And U.S. involvement in the tanker wars is trying to slowly roll back at this time, but we're conducting operations as normal and still providing convoy support to those reflagged tankers. And so they did a great workup. Those sailors, from research and from testimony, were superbly trained. There's numerous books and podcasts specifically just about this crew because of how important and powerful this story is. But as they were cruising during convoy operations in the late afternoon of 14 April 1988, the Roberts stumbled into a minefield, and a lookout just in the nick of time spotted a suspicious object and alerted the bridge. And so the captain brought the engines to full stop and began to back slowly out of the minefields, not knowing where else would be safe to travel. As the Roberts crept astern, it struck an estimated 500-pound explosive that was a naval mine right below the hull. It punctured a large hole in the engine room, and for the next several hours and into the night, the valiant crew of the Samuel B. Roberts struggled to keep the ship afloat. It's very much a testimony to how strong the U.S. Navy is in terms of damage control. But unfortunately, it is a story that also demonstrates that mine warfare once again snuck up on military operations during Operation Earnest Will.
You know, you read about the great devastation a simple mine can do on a mighty ship, and it's kind of like it's the granddaddy of irregular warfare. It reminds me when I read these accounts of how it kind of presages the things we deal with. Like look at what drones did to the Russian air fleet not too long ago. A small thing can have a big impact on a much more expensive asset, and mine's kind of wrote the book on that. And yeah, the need to be aware of that is definitely something to never forget. And I look at the statistics here, and the Roberts wasn't alone. I mean, mines have damaged U.S. ships far more than any other element. Air attack, another ship. It's kind of a startling graphic that appears in your article as well. So what ensues as this evolves? The final phase, what I guess you could say, is Operation Praying Mantis. What brings that on, and what's the outcome of that one?
Yes, sir. That is sort of, yes, the closing act, more or less, of the tanker war and U.S. involvement in it. And that is the climax that brings about the end. And so some historians and scholarship might point to other sources, but notably, Operation Praying Mantis begins 4 days after the Roberts strikes a mine. And so at the time, senior leadership, it's reported and studied, wanted to proportionally respond to the tragedy that was the Samuel B. Roberts mining incident. And so 3 U.S. Navy surface action groups are sorted to be able to retaliate against Iranian oil platforms and also a named Iranian warship that later came out at the time, the Sablan. Yes, sir. So Operation Praying Mantis is a direct result of the U.S.'s ability to choose the time and place in which it responds to its adversaries, and was able to regain the initiative and offensive power to be able to strike back in retaliation for the Roberts.
In the end, the tanker war, the operations that made it up, succeeded. The oil started getting through there. Um, the threat was essentially curtailed, but the glaring lesson from that isn't one of triumphalism, but how we missed the boat with the mine factor. And this is still a factor today. You compare it specifically and quite logically and accurately to the Taiwan Strait situation. That's just got mine warfare potential written all over it. Why don't you talk about some of the takeaways you brought from this historical episode to the current geopolitical situation and how mines may play out in that, and what we can do, what Marines specifically can do?
Yes, sir. Thank you. There are several areas across the globe today that I think this may have staying power. And so in the midst of great power competition, or if we're looking at other military operations, these lessons equally apply. And so while mine warfare might not always be present every time in every single one of these conflicts, these lessons are still able to be extrapolated and applied to a number of military operations. I outlined 4 key lessons in my article, which I would love to direct listeners to. But to just briefly summarize them here, the first is that convoy operations poorly address mine warfare, just in structure of how these sorts of operations are prosecuted, and historically showing that same sort of vivid mental image of the Bridgeton having to lead the convoy, the ship that is supposed to be protected, leading the convoy as the ships that are supposed to be protecting are in tow. The second lesson is that offensive search and seizure operations can disrupt mining. So we did not talk about it as much, but U.S. Army helicopters sorting off the Jarrett were able to interdict a number of Iranian mine lane vessels. And so that's also a very important historical case that I outline more thoroughly in my article as well. But when we have assets that are in theater and going forward into the battle space to be able to target known mine lane entities, combining those assets, intelligence at hand, and strong operational planning is able to disrupt the adversary or enemy's ability to conduct mine warfare. The third is that expeditionary assets are essential for prosecuting mine warfare missions. Also, in my article, I referenced the USS Guadalcanal, which was sorted to the battle space at the time. And so this increase in hulls that were in the region and also the capabilities that it brought along with them increased our ability to counteract, provide mine countermeasures. The fourth lesson that I outline is that mine warfare requires forward and distributed operations. And so I think this is where this lesson has the most applicability to today. And also when we think about things like force design for the United States Marine Corps, that if we are forward and conducting distributed operations, we are going to have the resources at hand, the initiative of our personnel at the ready, and also the ability to be able to be in theater at the time that these sorts of events go down. It's not enough that, yes, we have these capabilities, but if they're not in theater, they're not able to produce effects there. And so those are the 4 lessons that I outlined in my article. They go through more thoroughly when they're in the written word. But I think those 4 are able to be applied to any circumstance today, whether it be great power competition or any sort of military operation that might involve some sort of mine threat in the maritime domain.
That's not going to go away, for sure. Well, here's a crowning example of how, if you want to understand the present, look to the past. And if you want to delineate present challenges, look to how we dealt with them before, or how we learned to deal with them and got better at it as we went along. You've done a great job of pointing it out to us, and I would invite readers, if they haven't read it yet, to dig into this in the current June issue of Naval History. There's a lot more meaty detail in there, as Quentin has indicated, and it's quite a story on many levels. Instructive, but also just interesting as history. The fact you found something, Quentin, that interested you and had not been, so to speak, done to death, and you took that ball and you ran with it, that's the right instinct. You keep that up. It's encouraging to hear. I have hope for the future when I hear that. So thank you for joining us, Second Lieutenant Quentin Zimmer, USMC. It's been a pleasure having you on here. Congratulations on being one of the contest winners.
Thank you.
And we look forward to seeing more from you down the road as your time allows you. Keep on writing and thinking. That's
Thanks
the idea.
So much, sir. I appreciate your time today.
It's been a pleasure. That's it for us for today, folks. Until next time, I'm Eric Mills, Editor-in-Chief of Naval History Magazine. Remember, the past is prologue, and let's keep learning from it. Farewell.